In a quiet corner of a sleepy town, where dim streetlights barely concealed peeling walls and sagging rooftops, the Carter family clung to fragile threads of hope. Ethan, a 17-year-old boy with grease-stained hands and determined eyes, spent most of his time at the old garage near their home. Blessed with a natural talent for fixing machines and an unwavering passion for cars, Ethan poured himself into every repair, not just for the money, but for the faint hope of lifting his family out of their struggles. Meanwhile, Ethan's younger sister, Mia, held on to a simple dream. A steaming bowl of noodles or a fresh red apple at the dinner table, small comforts that could brighten her entire day. And Leo, the youngest, ran around with carefree joy, his tiny feet clad in mismatched socks. But could their innocence endure the weight of a childhood shaped by scarcity? At the kitchen table, their mother, Mrs. Carter, tirelessly flipped through a growing stack of unpaid bills. Bold red numbers seemed to taunt her, a cruel reminder that time was running out. How can I keep the lights on? How can I keep my children warm through the bitter winter nights? These questions haunted her, echoing through her weary heart without answers. Little did they know, a single act of kindness from Ethan would spark a brighter future for their family. Join us today as we uncover the journey of how Ethan and his family rose above their challenges. Before we dive into the heart of today's story, why not take a moment to share where you're tuning in from and what the weather's like there? Gather your loved ones, maybe pour yourself something warm and comforting, and settle in for an inspiring tale of resilience and hope. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It's your encouragement that fuels us to bring you even more meaningful content. Thank you for being here with us. Now, let's begin. Ethan adjusted the straps of his patched-up backpack as he trudged down the cracked sidewalk. The soles of his sneakers, worn thin and peeling, scraped against the pavement with every step. Each step seemed to echo the weight he carried. Not just the bag on his back, but the invisible burden of responsibility that loomed over him like a shadow. It was late afternoon, and the summer sun blazed mercilessly, making his faded t-shirt stick to his back. Ethan had spent the morning at school, barely keeping his focus through lectures. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about bills, the electricity cut off at home, and his evening shift at the garage. His mom's voice from that morning still rang in his ears. "We're behind again, Ethan. I don't know how much longer we can hold on." As he passed through the park, Ethan tried to quicken his pace. The park was a shortcut to the garage, but it also served as a daily reminder of everything he didn't have. Families lounged on picnic blankets under the shade of sprawling oak trees. Kids laughed as they ran through the sprinklers, and a faint scent of grilled food wafted through the air. Ethan's stomach churned at the smell, but he forced himself to keep walking. Near the park's fountain, a group of boys caught Ethan's attention. They looked around his age, but their lives couldn't have been more different. They wore crisp, clean clothes, their shoes spotless and new. Their loud, carefree laughter carried across the park as they tossed a soccer ball back and forth. Ethan glanced down at his own shoes, the frayed edges brushing the ground, and felt a pang of self-consciousness. He tried to ignore the boys and focused on the gravel path ahead, but one of them noticed him. "Hey, nice shoes," the boy jeered, loud enough for everyone to hear. His friends burst into laughter, the kind that stung more than the words themselves. Ethan's face burned, but he kept his head down, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to say something, but what could he possibly say? Instead, he shoved his hands into his pockets and walked faster, the sound of their laughter following him like an unwanted companion. It wasn't the first time. Kids like them always found a way to make him feel small, like he didn't belong. "They don't know anything about my life," Ethan thought bitterly. "They don't know what it's like to worry about the lights being shut off, or to see your mom cry over bills she can't pay." As the boys' laughter faded into the background, Ethan's thoughts shifted to his mother. He pictured her sitting at their small kitchen table, the same table where they shared countless meager meals. He remembered the pile of unopened envelopes next to her, her hands trembling as she shuffled through them. She tried so hard to shield Ethan and his younger sister, Mia, from the weight of their struggles, but Ethan always noticed. He saw the way her shoulders sagged under the pressure, The way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. He clenched his jaw. He had to keep helping her. If that meant more hours at the garage, then so be it. There was no room for distractions, not even the sting of cruel laughter from boys who couldn't understand his reality. The sun hung lower in the sky as Ethan trudged through the park, the weight of his patched-up backpack making his shoulders ache. His stomach growled, reminding him that the simple sandwich in his bag was the only thing standing between him and hunger until dinner, if there even was one waiting at home. He quickened his pace, eager to reach the garage where his shift would start soon, but something caught his eye as he passed the fountain. An elderly man sat alone on a weathered park bench, his wrinkled hands resting limply on his knees. He was dressed in clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days, and his white hair stuck out at odd angles. His eyes, cloudy and unfocused, stared blankly at the fountain in front of him. Ethan stopped in his tracks. There was something about the man's expression, a mixture of confusion and sadness, that tugged at him. The park was bustling with families and children, but no one seemed to notice the old man. He looked completely out of place, like he'd wandered into a world that no longer recognized him. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the path ahead. He could keep walking, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and focus on his own problems. After all, he had enough to worry about. His mom, his little sister, the pile of unpaid bills that seemed to grow taller every day. But something held him there. He thought of his grandfather, who had passed away years ago. His mom often spoke about how kind and compassionate he had been, always ready to lend a hand to anyone in need. If he were alive, he'd help this man without hesitation, Ethan thought. What if that were him sitting there? With a deep breath, Ethan walked over to the bench. He shifted nervously, unsure how to start. Excuse me, sir, he said, his voice tentative. The man blinked, as though coming out of a fog, and slowly turned to look at Ethan. His eyes searched Ethan's face, but it was clear he didn't recognize him, or maybe anyone. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but steady. The man didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head, his lips moving as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. Ethan noticed the slight tremble in his hands and the way his shoulders sagged, as though the weight of his confusion was too much to bear. Ethan hesitated, then glanced at the sandwich in his bag. His stomach twisted at the thought of giving it up. It was all he had for the rest of the day, but the man looked so lost, so vulnerable. "Do you need something to eat?" Ethan asked, pulling out the sandwich. "It's not much, but it might help." The man's eyes flickered to the sandwich, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, son." Ethan sat down on the bench, unwrapped the sandwich, and handed half of it to the man. They sat in silence as the man took small, deliberate bites. Around them, the sounds of the park continued, children laughing, dogs barking, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. But for Ethan, the world seemed quieter here. The man's hands steadied as he ate, and a bit of color returned to his face. "You're a good boy," he said finally, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. Not many people would stop. Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "It's nothing," he mumbled, though deep down, he felt a small flicker of pride. They sat like that for a few more minutes, the silence between them comfortable. Then Ethan noticed a figure approaching from the other side of the park. A man, probably in his late 30s, was walking briskly toward them, his tailored suit and polished shoes at odds with the casual parkgoers around him. His expression was a mixture of worry and relief, and his eyes scanned the park until they landed on the elderly man. "Dad!" the man called out, quickening his pace. The elderly man looked up, his cloudy eyes clearing slightly. "There you are," he murmured, a faint smile crossing his face. The younger man reached them and crouched in front of the older man, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I've been looking for you for hours," he said, his voice trembling with relief. He turned to Ethan, his gaze softening. "Have you been with him this whole time?" Ethan nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, I saw him sitting here, and he looked lost. I just wanted to help." The man's expression shifted, gratitude replacing the worry that had lined his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice earnest. You have no idea how much this means to me. Ethan shrugged again, unsure what to say. It wasn't a big deal, he muttered. But the man shook his head. It was. You didn't have to stop, but you did. Most people wouldn't have. He paused, his gaze lingering on Ethan's face, as if trying to understand why someone so young would show such kindness. What's your name? Ethan, he replied quietly. Well, Ethan, the man said, standing and extending his hand. I'm Lucas, and this is my father, Robert. Ethan shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who was both grateful and deeply moved. Lucas helped his father to his feet, steadying him with an arm around his shoulders. He turned back to Ethan, his expression serious but kind. Thank you for looking out for him. If there's ever anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to ask. Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. He watched as Lucas guided Robert away, the two of them disappearing down the park path. Ethan sat on the bench for a few moments longer, staring at the remaining half of his sandwich. His stomach growled again, but the hunger felt less pressing now. As he stood and slung his backpack over his shoulder, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of kindness might ripple out into something bigger. He had no way of knowing that the next time he saw Lucas, it would change his life forever. Ethan pushed open the front door of his small, weathered home, the familiar creak of the hinges echoing in the quiet hallway. The house was dim, the oppressive silence only broken by the faint rustle of papers coming from the kitchen. He let out a slow breath and stepped inside, setting his patched-up backpack carefully by the door. Ethan? That you? His mother's voice called from the next room. Yeah, Ma, he replied, trying to sound upbeat despite the weight pressing on his chest. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, hunched over a stack of envelopes. The flickering light of a single candle illuminated her face, and he could see the worry etched into her features. She looked up briefly as he entered, offering a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. How was your day? She asked, setting down one of the envelopes and massaging her temple. It was fine, Ethan said, avoiding her gaze as he crossed to the sink to wash his hands. He didn't want to tell her about the boys in the park, or how hungry he still was after sharing his only meal with the elderly man. He turned back to her, noticing for the first time that the hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the light bulb in the corner were gone. They cut the power again? He asked, though he already knew the answer. His mother sighed, her shoulders sagging. Yeah, they said we're too far behind. She gestured to the stack of bills, her voice strained. I tried calling them, but they won't budge this time. Ethan's stomach twisted as he walked over to her. He looked down at the envelopes, most of them marked with bold, red letters, final notice. I'm sorry, Ma, he said quietly, unsure what else to say. She shook her head, forcing another smile. Don't apologize, sweetheart. You're doing everything you can. It's not your fault. But it felt like his fault. Ethan thought of the hours he spent at the garage after school, the grease-stained clothes, the constant exhaustion. It still wasn't enough. No matter how much he worked, no matter how hard he tried, it felt like they were always falling behind. I'll take on more shifts, Ethan said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His mother frowned, her tired eyes meeting his. Ethan, you're already doing too much. You have school, and you're barely getting any sleep as it is. I can handle it, he insisted, his voice firm. I'll figure it out. We'll get the lights back on, Ma. I promise. She looked at him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. You shouldn't have to carry this, Ethan, she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. You're just a boy. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, anger bubbling up, not at her, but at the situation they were stuck in. I'm not a boy, Ma. Not anymore. I can help, and I will. Her eyes softened, glistening with unshed tears. She reached out, placing a hand on his cheek. You have such a big heart, Ethan. You remind me so much of your father. Ethan swallowed hard and looked away, blinking back the sting in his own eyes. He hated seeing her like this, so worn down, so defeated. He wanted to fix everything for her, to take away all the worry and pain, but the truth was, he didn't know how. He sat down at the table across from her, the candlelight casting shadows on the walls. The room felt too quiet, too heavy. He glanced at the stack of envelopes again, then at the faint outline of his mother's hands trembling as she sorted through them. In the back of his mind, he thought of the elderly man in the park. The image of the man's frail hands gripping the sandwich and the grateful smile on his face played over and over in his mind. He didn't understand why it felt so important, why it lingered in his thoughts like an unresolved question. "Ma," he said hesitantly, then stopped. She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Nothing," he muttered, shaking his head. He couldn't bring himself to tell her about the man or the younger man in the suit who had thanked him so earnestly. It felt private, like something he needed to hold on to for himself. His mother sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Well, if you're sure," she said, her voice soft. "But you know you can always tell me anything, right?" "I know," Ethan said quickly. They sat in silence for a while, the flickering candlelight casting their shadows on the wall. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the room grew darker. Ethan's mother eventually stood, stretching and running a hand through her hair. "I should get some rest," she said. "I've got a long day tomorrow, and you do too." Ethan nodded, standing as well. He helped her blow out the candle, then followed her down the hallway to their small bedrooms. As he lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, Ethan's mind raced. The weight of their struggles pressed down on him, but amidst the chaos of his thoughts, the memory of the old man and his quiet gratitude shone like a small beacon. Maybe kindness isn't just something you give. It's something that stays with you, Ethan thought, letting the idea settle in his mind. He closed his eyes, clutching the thin blanket tightly around himself. The night was cold without the heater, but he tried not to think about it. Tomorrow would bring another long day, school, work, and more challenges, but he was determined to face it. For his mom, for his sister, and maybe, just maybe, for himself. The morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains in Ethan's room, casting soft streaks across the worn wooden floor. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, the heaviness of another day pressing down on him. The electricity was still out, and the chill of the night lingered in the air. Ethan could hear his mother moving about in the kitchen, her soft footsteps accompanied by the faint clink of dishes. After quickly getting dressed, he stepped into the kitchen to find his mother sitting at the table, staring at the same pile of bills she had been the night before. The dim glow of a candle illuminated her tired face, and Ethan's heart sank at the sight. He grabbed his patched-up backpack and prepared to head to school, determined to make it through the day and get to his shift at the garage. He was about to step out the door when a rumbling noise stopped him in his tracks. The sound of a car engine, a deep, smooth hum unlike anything he was used to hearing in their neighborhood, grew louder. Ethan turned to see a sleek black car pull up and park in front of their small house. The vehicle's glossy exterior and polished rims seemed out of place among the cracked sidewalks and faded houses that lined their street. "Ethan, who's that?" his mother called from the kitchen, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't know," he replied, stepping closer to the window. The car door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. Ethan recognized him instantly. It was the younger man from the park, the one who had come to find his elderly father. His heart began to race. What was he doing here? The man looked up and spotted Ethan through the window. A kind smile spread across his face as he approached the house. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to do, but finally opened the door as the man reached the porch. "Ethan, right?" the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Lucas. Do you mind if I come in for a moment?" Ethan glanced over his shoulder at his mother, who had appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. Her brows were furrowed, and she looked between Ethan and Lucas with a mix of confusion and caution. "It's okay, Ma," Ethan said softly. "I know him. Kind of." His mother hesitated, then nodded. "Come in," she said, her voice wary. Lucas stepped inside, his presence filling the small space with an air of quiet authority. He removed his jacket and folded it over his arm, his movements deliberate and respectful. Ethan's mother gestured for him to sit at the table, and Lucas complied, glancing briefly at the stack of bills before focusing his attention on her. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," Lucas began, his tone sincere. But I wanted to thank Ethan again. What he did for my father yesterday, it meant the world to me. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. It wasn't a big deal, he muttered, staring at the floor. Lucas shook his head. It was a very big deal. My father has Alzheimer's, and he wandered off while I was at work. I've been struggling to keep up with everything, and when I finally found him, seeing someone care enough to help, he paused, his voice catching slightly. Well, it reminded me that there's still kindness in the world. Ethan's mother softened at Lucas's words, her earlier caution giving way to a quiet understanding. Ethan has a good heart, she said, her voice proud but tired. He's always helping, even when we don't have much to give. Lucas nodded, his gaze shifting between Ethan and his mother. That's exactly why I'm here. I don't want this to be just a thank you. I want to do something meaningful to show my gratitude. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I understand things might be difficult right now. I'd like to offer you a job, Mrs. Carter. Ethan's mother blinked, clearly taken aback. A job? She repeated, her voice uncertain. Lucas nodded. Yes, at my company. I run a logistics firm, and we're always looking for dependable, hardworking people. From what I've seen, you have the qualities we value. This isn't charity, he added quickly, sensing her hesitation. It's an opportunity, one you've more than earned. Ethan's mother stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I don't have much experience, she said quietly, and I don't want to accept something I haven't worked for. Lucas smiled gently. You'd be helping me as much as I'd be helping you. It's a real job, with fair pay and training if you need it. I just want to give you the chance to get back on your feet. Ethan watched his mother closely, noticing the way her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. He could see the internal battle playing out on her face, the pride that made her want to refuse, clashing with the desperation that made her want to say yes. After a long pause, she finally nodded. All right, she said, her voice steady but quiet. If it's a job, and I'll earn what I make, I'll accept. Lucas's smile widened, relief evident in his expression. Thank you. I'll have everything set up for you to start tomorrow. I'll come by in the morning to take you to the office and show you around. Ethan's mother nodded again, her eyes glistening with a mixture of gratitude and determination. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stood, extending a hand to her. You're very welcome, Mrs. Carter. And Ethan, he added, turning to the boy with a warm smile, thank you again. None of this would have happened without you. Ethan nodded, his cheeks flushing as Lucas shook his hand. He watched as the man put on his jacket and stepped out the door, leaving their small home feeling strangely brighter despite the lingering darkness from the lack of electricity. For the first time in a long while, Ethan saw a glimmer of hope in his mother's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder if his small act of kindness had set something much larger in motion. Ethan awoke the next morning to the sound of his mother bustling in the kitchen. The house still felt cold and quiet without electricity, but there was something different in the air, a sense of energy and purpose that hadn't been there in a long time. He pulled on his worn-out clothes and stepped into the kitchen, where his mother was smoothing out the wrinkles in a blouse she had borrowed from a neighbor. Her hair was neatly tied back, and though her face still bore the lines of worry, her eyes sparkled with something Ethan hadn't seen in years, hope. Morning, Ma, he said, grabbing a piece of bread from the table. Good morning, sweetheart, she replied, glancing at him with a nervous smile. You ready for school? Ethan nodded, chewing on the bread. You ready for your first day? She paused, her hands stilling on the blouse. I think so. Lucas said he'd pick me up at 8. He's been so kind. Ethan, I just hope I don't let him down. You won't, Ethan said firmly. You're going to do great, Ma. I know it. Her smile softened, and she reached over to ruffle his hair. Thank you, honey. That means a lot. At exactly 8 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up outside their house. Ethan watched from the window as Lucas stepped out, dressed in a smart but casual outfit. He greeted Ethan's mother with a friendly smile, holding the car door open for her. She turned and waved at Ethan before climbing into the car, her expression a mixture of excitement and nerves. Ethan waved back, feeling a swell of pride. This was it, the start of something new for their family. At school, however, things weren't so hopeful. Ethan trudged through the crowded hallways, keeping his head down as the wealthier kids brushed past him, their laughter echoing against the walls. He had learned to navigate the taunts and whispers, but some days it was harder to ignore them. "Hey, nice backpack, Carter," a boy called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he gestured to Ethan's patched and fraying bag. Ethan gritted his teeth but didn't respond, focusing on getting to his next class. He reminded himself of his mother's smile that morning, of Lucas's encouraging words. Things were changing, and he wouldn't let the taunts of a few spoiled kids bring him down. By lunchtime, though, the weight of the morning had started to wear on him. He found his usual spot in the far corner of the cafeteria, away from the noise and chatter. Opening his lunchbox, he sighed at the sight of 2 small bread rolls and a slice of cheese. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Mind if I sit here?" a voice said, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. He looked up to see a boy about his age standing nearby, holding a lunch tray. The boy had a friendly smile and an easygoing demeanor that immediately put Ethan at ease. Sure," Ethan said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. The boy sat down, setting his tray on the table. "I'm Jake," he said, extending a hand. "You're Ethan, right?" Ethan shook his hand, nodding. "Yeah. How'd you know?" "James told me about you," Jake said, grinning. "My mom works at his garage, and he's always talking about this hardworking kid who's helping out after school. I figured it had to be you." Ethan blinked, surprised. "James talks about me?" "Only good things," Jake said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "He says you've got a real knack for fixing things. That's pretty cool." Ethan felt his cheeks flush, a mix of pride and embarrassment washing over him. "I'm just trying to help out my family," he said quietly. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's admirable. Not a lot of people our age would take on that kind of responsibility. If you ever need someone to talk to, or, just hang out with, I'm around." Ethan hesitated, unused to this kind of open kindness. But something about Jake's easy smile and genuine tone made him feel comfortable. "Thanks," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like that." They spent the rest of lunch talking about school, the garage, and their families. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of normalcy, a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. That evening, Ethan walked into the kitchen to find his mother sitting at the table, her face glowing with an excitement he hadn't seen in years. The faint candlelight softened her features, making her look younger and more relaxed. "How was it?" Ethan asked, setting his backpack down. "It was amazing," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Lucas was so patient, showing me everything I needed to know. The people there were kind, and the work. It felt good, Ethan, like I was doing something that mattered." Ethan grinned, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "I told you, Ma, you're going to be great at this." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "And you're the reason any of this is happening. Your kindness, your hard work, it's all paying off." Ethan looked down, his cheeks warming. "It's not just me, Ma. We're in this together." That night, as they ate a modest dinner of rice and beans, the mood in the house was lighter than it had been in years. His mother talked about her plans for the job. Jake's words of encouragement replayed in Ethan's mind, and for the first time, the future didn't seem quite so daunting. Ethan lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling. The challenges weren't over. The bills were still there, the lights were still out, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving forward. And that was enough to keep him going. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Ethan pushed open the door to the garage. The familiar scent of oil and metal filled his senses, and the rhythmic clinking of tools echoed through the space. James, the owner of the garage, was under the hood of an old pickup truck, his calloused hands expertly navigating the engine's tangled maze. "Hey, kid," James called out without looking up. "You're just in time. Got a real mess here that needs sorting." Ethan smiled, dropping his patched-up backpack in its usual spot by the wall. He grabbed a pair of gloves and joined James, eager to lose himself in the comforting routine of work. "What's the problem?" Ethan asked, peering under the hood. "Starter's shot, and the wiring's a disaster," James said, straightening up. He wiped his hands on a rag and gave Ethan a nod. "Think you can figure it out?" Ethan blinked, surprised. "You want me to do it?" James grinned. "You've been hanging around here long enough. Let's see if any of my wisdom's rubbed off on you." Ethan felt a flicker of nervousness but nodded, rolling up his sleeves. James stepped aside, watching as Ethan carefully examined the engine. For the next hour, Ethan worked methodically, tracing wires and replacing the faulty starter under James's watchful eye. There were a few missteps. He accidentally disconnected a hose at one point, but James was patient, guiding him without stepping in too much. "Not bad," James said when Ethan finally wiped his grease-covered hands on his jeans. The engine roared to life as Ethan turned the key in the ignition, filling the garage with its steady hum. Ethan couldn't help but grin. "I did it." "You sure did," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've got a good head for this stuff, Ethan. Quick learner, too." Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "Thanks, but it's just fixing cars. Nothing special." James's expression softened, and he leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "Now, that's where you're wrong, kid. What you're doing here, using your hands, solving problems, it's a skill. And skills like that can take you places." Ethan looked down at the floor, unsure how to respond. James continued, his tone serious but encouraging. "I've seen plenty of kids come through here, and most of them don't have half your work ethic. You've got potential, Ethan, real potential, which is why I've been thinking." Ethan glanced up, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Thinking what? How'd you feel about an apprenticeship?" James asked, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ethan froze, the words hanging in the air. "An apprenticeship? With you?" James nodded. "You've got a knack for this, and I'd be happy to teach you everything I know. It'll be hard work, more than what you're already doing, but I think you're up for it. What do you say?" Ethan felt a surge of emotions, excitement, disbelief, and a hint of fear. The idea of learning more, of becoming something more than just a kid trying to make ends meet, was overwhelming. "I don't know," Ethan said hesitantly. "I mean, I'd love to, but I still have school, and my mom needs me to help at home." James nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it, and I'm not saying it has to happen all at once. We'll figure out a schedule that works for you. But think about it, okay? You've got a real future here, Ethan, if you're willing to work for it." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. That evening, as Ethan walked home, the weight of James's offer settled on his shoulders. He replayed the conversation in his head, imagining what it would be like to learn more, to have a skill that could actually build a better life for his family. When he stepped into the house, the warm glow of a candle greeted him, along with the sound of his mother's laughter. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Mia and Leo, helping them with their homework. "Hey, sweetheart," his mother said, looking up as he entered. "How was work?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "It was good. James, he offered me an apprenticeship today." Her eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and pride lighting up her face. "An apprenticeship? Ethan, that's amazing." "I told him I'd think about it," Ethan said, setting his backpack down. "It sounds great, but I don't want to take on more than I can handle." His mother reached over, taking his hand in hers. "Ethan, you've been working so hard for us, and I'm so proud of you. But this is your chance to do something for yourself. If you want to do it, we'll make it work." Ethan looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes giving him a sense of reassurance. "Thanks, Ma. I'll talk to James about it tomorrow." The next day, Ethan returned to the garage with a renewed sense of determination. James greeted him with his usual grin, already elbow-deep in an engine. "Well?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I want to do it. I want to learn." James's grin widened. "Attaboy. Let's get started." Over the next few weeks, James became more than just Ethan's boss. He became a mentor. He taught Ethan everything from diagnosing engine problems to rebuilding transmissions, always with patience and a touch of humor. As Ethan's skills grew, so did his confidence. For the first time, he began to see a future beyond the endless cycle of bills and struggles. He imagined himself working as a full-fledged mechanic, providing for his family in a way that felt meaningful and sustainable. One evening, as Ethan finished up at the garage, James handed him a set of wrenches, their handles worn but sturdy. "These are yours now," James said. "Every good mechanic needs his own tools." Ethan stared at the wrenches, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you, James, for everything." James patted him on the back, his voice gruff but kind. "You've earned it, kid. And don't forget, you've got what it takes to make something of yourself. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ethan nodded, clutching the wrenches tightly. As he walked home that night, the weight of his new tools felt like the promise of a brighter future. The hum of progress was subtle but unmistakable in Ethan's household. The flicker of candlelight still illuminated their evenings, but now it seemed to glow with warmth rather than despair. His mother, once weighed down by the relentless tide of unpaid bills and uncertainty, was beginning to find her footing in her new job. Every morning, she rose before the sun, smoothing her neatly pressed blouse and gathering her notes from the training sessions Lucas had arranged. Each evening, she returned home with a spark in her eyes, eager to share the details of her day over their modest dinners. One such evening, Ethan watched as his mother set her bag down on the worn kitchen table and pulled out a crisp envelope. "What's that, Ma?" Mia asked, leaning forward eagerly. "A little something for us," his mother said, her smile radiating pride. "It's my first paycheck." Leo's eyes widened, and he clapped his small hands. "Does that mean we can have lights again?" Ethan saw his mother's expression soften as she crouched down to Leo's level. "Not just yet, sweetheart, but soon. This is just the beginning. We'll get there, I promise." Ethan felt a swell of pride as he watched the exchange. The sight of his mother standing a little taller, her voice filled with determination, was a stark contrast to the weary woman who had once spent sleepless nights at the kitchen table, staring hopelessly at a stack of bills. The days passed with a rhythm that was still demanding but no longer suffocating. Ethan continued splitting his time between school and the garage, while his mother adapted to the routines of her new job. Small victories began to emerge: an extra loaf of bread on the table, the occasional piece of fresh fruit for Mia, and a new pair of socks for Leo, who had been wearing mismatched ones for weeks. One Saturday morning, Ethan found his mother sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad and a calculator. "What are you working on?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of water. "Budgeting," she replied, tapping the pen against the table thoughtfully. "Lucas says if I can get through the next month without missing any payments, I'll qualify for an advance that could help us get the electricity back on." Ethan pulled up a chair and leaned over to look at her calculations. "Do you need help? I can pick up more hours at the garage if we're short." She shook her head, placing a hand on his arm. "You're already doing so much, Ethan. This isn't just on you anymore. We're a team, remember?" Ethan nodded, her words filling him with a sense of relief. For the first time, he felt like they were truly working together, not just surviving, but striving for something better. That evening, the family gathered around the small kitchen table for dinner. Ethan had managed to grab a bag of fresh vegetables on his way home from the garage, and his mother had turned them into a hearty soup. As they ate, Mia and Leo chattered excitedly about their day at school, their laughter echoing through the tiny space. Ethan smiled as he listened, marveling at how light the atmosphere felt compared to just a few weeks ago. "Ethan, did you know Leo drew a picture of you in class today?" Mia teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Really?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "What did it look like?" Leo grinned, holding up a wrinkled piece of paper. The drawing was simple but unmistakable. Ethan standing tall next to a car, holding a wrench in one hand. "It's you fixing a car," Leo said proudly. "You're the best at it." Ethan's chest tightened as he looked at the drawing. The admiration in Leo's eyes was both humbling and motivating. "Thanks, buddy," Ethan said, ruffling his brother's hair. "Maybe one day, I'll teach you how to fix cars too. Can I learn to?" Mia chimed in, giggling. Of course, Ethan said with a grin. You'll both be pros in no time. Later that night, after Mia and Leo had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the front steps of their small home, staring out at the quiet street. His mother joined him, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. They're so happy, she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. It's been so long since I've heard them laugh like that. Ethan nodded, resting his elbows on his knees. It's because of you, Ma. You're giving them hope again. She turned to him, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. It's not just me, Ethan. It's you too. You've been their rock and mine. I don't know what we would have done without you. Ethan looked away, his cheeks flushing. I'm just doing what I can. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm yet comforting. And that's more than enough. We're going to make it, Ethan. I can feel it. He nodded, the quiet determination in her voice settling something deep within him. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe her. The next day, Ethan walked into the garage with a renewed sense of purpose. James greeted him with his usual grin, tossing him a pair of gloves. Ready to get to work, kid? Always, Ethan replied, sliding the gloves on. As he worked, he thought about the progress his family was making, the changes that were slowly but surely transforming their lives. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving towards something better. And that, Ethan realized, was worth every ounce of effort. The steady hum of chatter filled the school cafeteria, but Ethan barely noticed as he picked at his lunch, a modest sandwich and an apple. His usual corner was quieter than the rest of the room, yet the isolation was intentional. Here, he could avoid the sharp eyes and sharper words of those who seemed to revel in mocking him. "Hey, Carter," a voice called. Cutting through the din, Ethan didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sneering tone was all too familiar. "What's in the lunchbox today? Another gourmet feast?" The boy's sarcastic laugh was echoed by his small group of friends. Ethan clenched his jaw, refusing to meet their gaze. He knew better than to engage. Drawing attention to himself would only make things worse. The boy wasn't deterred by Ethan's silence. "Come on, Carter. You could at least say thanks for the entertainment." He leaned over, swiping Ethan's apple from the table. "I'll take this, though. You don't look like you need it." Ethan's face burned, but he remained still. His fingers tightened around the edges of his lunchbox as the group walked away, their laughter fading into the crowd. He felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but forced himself to push it aside. He couldn't afford to let their words, or their actions, hold him back. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at the garage. The familiar scent of oil and metal was a comfort, as was the sight of James working beneath the hood of an old sedan. "Hey, kid," James said, glancing up as Ethan entered. "You're late. Trouble at school?" Ethan hesitated, unsure whether to answer. Finally, he shrugged. "Just the usual." James straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "The usual, huh? Those kids giving you a hard time again?" Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's nothing I can't handle." James studied him for a moment before setting the rag down. "Ethan, look at me." Reluctantly, Ethan met his gaze. "Those kids don't define you, understand? They don't know what you're capable of. But you do. You've got something they don't, a purpose, a drive to make something of yourself." Ethan nodded, but his chest still felt tight. "Listen, kid," James said, his tone softening. "Life's gonna throw all kinds of crap your way. But the way you handle it, that's what makes you strong. You've already faced more than most kids your age, and you're still standing. That's no small thing." Ethan took a deep breath, James's words settling over him like a shield. "Thanks, James. I'll try to remember that." "Good," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now, get over here and help me with this carburetor. No use letting a bad day ruin your evening." As the weeks went by, Ethan threw himself into his work at the garage and his responsibilities at home. The taunts at school didn't stop, but he learned to tune them out, focusing instead on the things that truly mattered. His mother's growing confidence in her job inspired him, and James's steady mentorship gave him a sense of direction he'd never had before. Slowly, a new vision for his future began to take shape. A future where he wasn't just surviving but thriving, building something lasting for himself and his family. One evening, as Ethan and James finished repairing an engine, James leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. "You've been doing great, Ethan," he said. "I can see it in the way you work. You've got a knack for this." "Thanks," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about having a purpose." James nodded. "And I think I want to keep doing this," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Not just as a job, but as a career. I want to be the kind of person my family can count on, the way you've been there for me." James's grin widened. "Now, that's what I like to hear. You keep that fire, kid. It'll take you far." That night, as Ethan walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he allowed himself to dream. He imagined a time when his mother wouldn't have to worry about bills, when Mia and Leo could grow up without feeling the weight of scarcity. He imagined himself running his own garage one day, a place where people came not just for repairs but for kindness and trust. The thought filled him with a sense of hope that was almost foreign, but he embraced it. For the first time, he wasn't just looking at the next step, he was looking at the horizon. When Ethan entered the house, he found his siblings asleep on the couch, their small faces peaceful in the dim light of a flickering candle. His mother was at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed as she reviewed a stack of papers. "Hey, Ma," he said softly, setting his bag down. She looked up, her expression softening. "Hi, sweetheart. How was work?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "It was good. James is teaching me a lot." Her eyes glistened with pride. "I'm glad. You deserve this, Ethan. You've worked so hard for all of us." He sat down across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "We're all working hard, Ma, and it's starting to pay off." She nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "It is, and we're going to keep moving forward, together." Ethan smiled, the warmth of her words filling the quiet room. They still had challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them, not just for his family, but for himself. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of their small home, casting a soft glow on the worn furniture and patched walls. Ethan woke to the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen, a melody he hadn't heard in years. It was a hopeful tune, one she used to sing when things weren't so heavy. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and padded to the kitchen, where she stood flipping through a stack of papers with a nervous but excited energy. "Morning, Ma," he said, his voice still groggy. She turned, smiling. "Morning, sweetheart. I didn't mean to wake you." "What's going on?" he asked, noting the way she kept smoothing the papers as though they might vanish. "Lucas called last night," she said, holding up the top sheet. "He wants to offer me a full-time position, with benefits." Ethan's heart swelled with pride. "That's amazing, Ma. I knew he'd see how great you are." Her smile faltered slightly. "It's a big step, Ethan. Full-time means more hours, more responsibility. But it also means stability, health insurance. We might finally get ahead." He crossed the room and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You've got this. We've got this. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out." She nodded, her confidence growing in his reassurance. "Thank you, Ethan. You've been my rock through all of this." Later that day, Ethan arrived at the garage, his steps lighter than usual. James was in his usual spot under a car, muttering to himself as he tinkered with an engine. "Morning, James," Ethan called, pulling on his gloves. James slid out from under the car, grinning up at him. "Well, don't you look chipper this morning? Something good happen?" Ethan nodded. "My mom just got offered a full-time job, with benefits." James's face lit up. "That's fantastic news, kid. You tell her I said congratulations. She's earned it." "I will," Ethan said, grabbing a wrench from the workbench. "And, thanks for everything, James. You've been a huge part of why things are turning around for us." James waved a hand dismissively, though his grin betrayed his pride. "Nah, that's all you and your ma. You're the ones putting in the work." Ethan smiled, his resolve deepening. "Still, I wouldn't be here without you. And I want you to know I'm serious about the apprenticeship. I want to learn everything." James raised an eyebrow. "Everything, huh?" That's a tall order. You sure you're ready for it? Absolutely, Ethan said, his voice steady. James chuckled. All right then, let's get to it. As the weeks passed, Ethan threw himself into his apprenticeship. James wasn't just teaching him how to fix cars. He was teaching him how to think critically, solve problems, and take pride in his work. The once intimidating machinery now felt like a puzzle Ethan was determined to master. Each evening, Ethan returned home with grease-stained hands and a tired but satisfied smile. His mother, often exhausted from her new role, would sit with him at the kitchen table, sharing stories about her day while they both sipped on cups of tea. Mia and Leo, sensing the shift in their family's fortunes, grew more confident and playful. Their laughter echoed through the house as they chased each other or colored at the kitchen table. Ethan often joined them, helping Mia with her drawings or playing make-believe games with Leo. One Friday evening, the family gathered around the table for dinner. It was a simple meal, rice, beans, and a few vegetables, but it felt like a feast. Ethan's mother set down a small cake in the center of the table, a rare treat she had picked up with her first full paycheck. What's the occasion, Ma? Mia asked, her eyes wide with excitement. No special occasion, their mother said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Just a celebration. Of all of us. For how far we've come. Ethan looked around the table, his chest tightening with gratitude. He saw the light in his siblings' eyes, the strength in his mother's smile, and the warmth of their collective determination. To us, Ethan said, raising his glass of water. To us, the others echoed, their voices harmonizing with hope. That night, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a weight pressing down on him. It felt like an open road, one he was finally ready to travel. He thought of James's mentorship, his mother's new job, and the laughter that had returned to their home. He thought of Mia and Leo growing up without the shadows of fear and scarcity. The road ahead was still long, but they had taken a step forward, a big one. And for Ethan, that was enough to believe in the brighter days to come. The early morning sunlight streamed through the window of Ethan's small bedroom, casting warm streaks on the walls. For the first time in years, he wasn't woken by the weight of anxiety or the chill of uncertainty. Instead, he lay there for a moment, listening to the soft murmurs of his siblings in the next room and the faint hum of life outside. The house felt different now, lighter, as though their struggles had finally begun to lift. Ethan sat up, running a hand through his hair as he thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had been far from easy. He still remembered the nights when the house was cloaked in darkness, not just from the lack of electricity, but from the despair that hung in the air. Yet, through it all, they had pushed forward, together. Downstairs, his mother was already bustling around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The table was still modest, but the meals were steady and nourishing, a far cry from the days when they had to ration every bite. Ethan joined her, taking over the task of flipping pancakes as Mia and Leo scampered in, their faces bright with anticipation for the day ahead. Good morning, Ethan, his mother said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for too long. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, Ethan replied, smiling. Too much on my mind. She nodded, understanding. Thinking about the garage? Yeah, he said, but it wasn't just the garage. He was thinking about everything, the past, the present, and what lay ahead. Later that day, Ethan walked to the garage. The streets felt familiar yet different, no longer just the backdrop of his struggles, but a symbol of how far he had come. James greeted him with a grin as he arrived, tossing him a wrench. Ready to get to work, kid? James asked. Always, Ethan replied, slipping on his gloves. As they worked, James paused, leaning against the hood of the car they were fixing. You've come a long way, Ethan, he said, his tone reflective. When you first walked in here, you looked like the world was on your shoulders. But now, you've got that fire. That's what'll carry you forward. Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. I wouldn't be here without you, James. You've taught me more than just fixing cars. You've shown me how to keep going, no matter how hard things get. James chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. Well, that's life, isn't it? You face the challenges, you keep moving, and eventually, you find your way. As the day wound down, Ethan found himself reflecting on James's words. The challenges they had faced as a family weren't just obstacles, they were lessons. They had taught him the value of resilience, the power of community, and the importance of kindness. He thought back to the moment when he shared his sandwich with the elderly man in the park. At the time, it felt like a small act, but it had set off a ripple that had changed their lives. That evening, the family gathered in the living room. The electricity was back on, and the faint glow of a single light bulb illuminated their faces. They weren't wealthy, but they had something far more valuable: hope. Mia and Leo sat on the floor, drawing pictures of what they wanted to be when they grew up. Mia held up a sketch of herself as a doctor, a stethoscope around her neck, while Leo proudly displayed a picture of a firefighter rescuing people from a burning building. "What about you, Ethan?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you want to be?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at his mother, who was watching him with a proud smile. "I think I want to own a garage someday," he said. "A place where I can help people, the way James has helped me. And maybe teach others, too, so they can build better lives for themselves." His mother reached over, placing a hand on his. "You'll do it, Ethan. I know you will. You've already proven you can overcome anything." As the evening wore on, Ethan stepped outside, letting the cool night air wash over him. The stars above seemed brighter than he remembered, as if they too were celebrating the family's newfound stability. He thought about the lessons he had learned. How a single act of compassion could spark a series of changes, how determination could turn small victories into monumental progress, and how having a support system made all the difference. He realized that their story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. They had gone from a family weighed down by hardship to one that was actively building a future. And while the road ahead would still have its challenges, Ethan knew they were ready for it. The next morning, Ethan woke with a sense of purpose. As he headed to the garage, he thought about how he could pay forward the kindness he had received. He thought about the kids at school who might be struggling in silence, the way he had been. He resolved to be the person who offered encouragement, the way James and Lucas had done for him. When Ethan arrived at the garage, James was waiting for him with a new project, a complicated repair that would test all the skills Ethan had learned. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't intimidated. He was ready. Ethan's journey is a reminder that even in the face of adversity, kindness and determination can pave the way for a brighter future. His story highlights the power of small actions, the importance of mentorship, and the strength found in unity. It's not about avoiding hardship, but learning to rise above it, one step at a time. For Ethan, the future wasn't just a destination. It was a path he was carving with each choice, each act of compassion, and each moment of resilience. And as he looked ahead, he knew one thing for certain: they were no longer alone. They were a family, stronger together, ready to face whatever came next.